This past week, I was listening to the Daily. It's a podcast that it was particularly reviewing this week on the Rwanda genocide in 1994 and the journey that country has taken since then, and the change in power and the different views that have gone back and forth. And it was just um, reminding me of this book I was reading a while ago by Miroslav Volf, Exclusion and Embrace. In a particular chapter I was reviewing with regards to the chapter 3 called Embrace, that was really noticing the complexity of the oppressor and the oppressed. This dichotomy that is created in a conflict where there is one who is overtaking the other. One is the victim, one is the victimizer. And in this book, Volf kind of teases that out a little bit, and he considers perhaps how there are certain complexities that occur after forgiveness and reconciliation are declared. And Volf details, that there are these unintended consequences that arise when we presume that we have arrived at a state of peace. And so in today's talk that I'm giving right now is I want to examine Volf's idea of a post-reconciliation, the considerations that he has for that term, and apply his ideas to reflections on my own ministry context, working with street-involved youth at a drop-in center. Because according to Volf, the notion of what he calls, and I quote, final reconciliation, which is like reconciliation that is done, and the pursuit of a universal emancipation, as he says, is not a persuasive end. He doesn't think that it's possible. It's not even. It shouldn't necessarily even be desirable, because if such this utopic goal is the aim, he argues that it will not necessarily produce the outcomes it hopes to achieve. In declaring the premise of this chapter, he states that, and I quote, he will advocate here the struggle for a non-final reconciliation based on a vision of reconciliation that cannot be undone. So, an end quote. So Volf believes that the unfinished brand of reconciliation is a presumption we need to work with to create an effective path towards the horizon of peace. Just get that picture, like the horizon of peace. If you think of a horizon, it's like you're never actually getting there. You're always chasing the horizon. And so peace being that kind of image versus anything else. So what Volf does is he outlines the various problems with the schema of this oppression and liberation. And he believes that the conflicts are messy. He said every conflict is going to be messy, and that the purity of innocence is not empirical. Like, it's not exact, and the longer, and particularly when the conflict is long in nature and it goes for a while, the more space exists for either party to, and I quote, find themselves sucked into the vortex of mutual reinforcing victimization, in which the one party appears more virtuous only because, being weaker, it has less opportunity to be cruel. And I gotta admit, when I read that, it's a pretty grim reality that he has on humanity and what humanity is capable of being so deprived, And so Volf's outlook on the fragility of human nature is quite prominent. And so he references to another person named Bauman, and according to Bauman, he gives this analogy. He says that when the weak overcome the dominant, all too often, not always, all too often, of course, they demand the reshuffling of cards, not another game. They do not blame the game, only the stronger hand of adversary. So that image of this, shuffling of cards, and the game not changing, but just reshuffling the deck to, flip the power dynamics. It just reminded me of the what happened in Rwanda, in how these powers, took place. And I don't know too much about what happened in Rwanda, but I do know that there was a back and forth, and how oppression can be found in many different scenarios. And so when I think about Wolf's perspective on final reconciliation, it really applied to the work that I was doing at that drop-in center for street youth in Toronto. I often reflect upon that, and when engaging for me with the marginalized populations and the youth whose lives are like chronically intertwined with violence and mental anguish, the environment we facilitate, holds a great deal of tension. We've had many scenarios where like we're trying to keep this a very low barrier context where people can feel open to come, but then it was my job to really create policies and procedures to ensure that the place was safe. So these two objectives often faced off in opposition to one another, because once the lower the barrier you have, like you kind of have to ease up on the policies and procedures. Not always, but that was often the situation. So I would actually usually tell my staff, rely on your relational capital to ease tensions and to help, marshal all these conflicts that occur. But there are certain points when, the infringement is just too high, and we have to lay down a policy, and we say this policy or this procedure, and we say, you can't do that. You're barred for 7 days or 30 days. The bar is like service restriction. You can't come in for a little bit. And when that happens, there is something that occurs to that relationship. Even if after the person has a service restriction, they can't be there for 7 days or whatnot, and they come back and it's a really ideal scenario where they say, it's my bad, I shouldn't have done that, or we say, don't worry about it, and we invite them back, and we are hospitable in that kind of way. Even if it's the most ideal situation, something happens to the relationship between that worker and that youth, and the power imbalance is quite obvious in that moment, and the youth knows their place, and you know your place, and if there is not a continuous engagement with one another, because oftentimes after that happens, the two can kind of, my scenario is like sometimes there's a tension there or an awkwardness that you just avoid the person altogether, and you nod and you acknowledge each other, but the relationship doesn't deepen. Sometimes it deepens, and that's a very positive thing that happens. But post reconciliation or post that forgiveness or whatnot, when that happens, what happens after, how we engage that is very important, because if you don't continuously engage with the same kind of intensity as what it took to actually earn the trust of the people, what ends up happening is that you might have like a judicial or procedural type of reconciliation that has occurred on the surface, but you will lack a relational reconciliation, which is really important. And so this brings us back to this idea of final reconciliation, or like arriving at peace. Because if you assume that and if your goal is final reconciliation, a resolved type of peace, then when you feel like you get there, you stop trying to facilitate that tension. You think, and the mode that you function in isn't the same. And in a way, when you feel like reconciliation is only partially there, and you're still working on it continuously, and you should, because you are working with people of difference. It's always going to be there, especially with different socioeconomic classes trying to engage with one another. I'm making this right now for anyone who's in a church trying to, bring diversity into their church, whether it's culturally or whether it's socioeconomic differences, and trying to reconcile those things. You're never going to get there. It's always constantly going to be needing to reconcile. But if you feel like you're like, you know what, we're in a good place, we have arrived, as soon as you get there, you let off the foot off the gas, and then there is a lack of continuous engagement that got you to that place where it felt like things were good. And so that's why I think Miroslav Volf's point on not landing on a final reconciliation or a peace helps us to, keep our pedal, our foot on the pedal, to continuously engage and foster the nurturing relationships that keep things connected, and we're always working on the relationship. This applies to everything, like including marriage or your relationship with children or whatnot. This is what we need to continuously do, and I think that this notion that he brings is very significant because there's so many theological implications to this, right? I mean, just the fact that we can reconcile the fact that that we only know in part, and that here on this earth we're only going to know in part until we see him face to face, and that peace and reconciliation is only going to come into its fullest when Jesus returns. And that notion of that eschatology helps us to inform the way that we function today, knowing that everything is only in part. And so just want to leave you with that thought, in reflecting upon Miroslav Volf's chapter 3. I encourage you to read that. So I'll see you guys, and thanks for listening.